Okay. Well, I really appreciate everybody coming out. I know there's a million things you could be doing tonight, and I'm, I think it's great that you participate in meetups. And it's great that you get to be able to do it from the comfort of your home office, which is also really cool. But ultimately, I think it's very telling of everyone that comes to these meetups that they're hungry to learn more and meet people. And I think it's a big responsibility as a meetup speaker to not waste your time. So hopefully I've prepared enough, and you come away feeling empowered, and that you can go better your organizations after. So I want to talk about measuring your engineering culture. First, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Clint, and I am the CTO and co-founder of a software company called Weave, just here in Lehigh, not too far from where I live. And I love wakeboarding, snow skiing, and I'm very, very, very passionate about developer operations and culture. That is something I love, and I think it's something that it ends up being very, very important at a company like Weave. We build small business software. We're not necessarily at the cutting edge of technology by any means. It's workflow software for small business and communication software for small business. So that means the barriers to entry are lower, and that means operational culture and efficiency is really how we're going to differentiate ourselves as an engineering department. So I want to start off with a story. We were lucky enough, me and my two co-founders, to be accepted into an incubator in the Bay Area called Y Combinator. And it's just a tech business incubator if you're not familiar with it, but it's a fairly prestigious one as far as incubators go. And so once we got accepted, we moved out to Mountain View for 3 months, and we got to rub shoulders with some amazing minds. It was actually really, really cool. We had advisors. The creator of Yahoo Mail and sold it was one of our advisors, and we just had a bunch of people that had had successful software businesses. And one of the cool things about Y Combinator is they invite a speaker every week to come speak to the group. And one of those was Brian Chesky of Airbnb. And they're all off the record, and they get to open up and be very candid about building businesses. And he told a story about when he got to meet with Peter Thiel. This quote actually is from Peter Thiel, not from Brian, just the stories from Brian. But he told a story about asking Peter Thiel for the single most important piece of business advice he could give the Airbnb founders. And Peter Thiel's response was, "Don't F up your culture." And that really resonated deeply with me and my other two co-founders on like, hey, culture is that important. At the time, Airbnb had already hit about $1 billion valuation or was close to it. And that's the advice that he wanted to pass on to us, was make sure you don't screw up your culture. And so that ultimately sent us down this long and deep culture rabbit hole. And I wanted to become an expert at operational culture. And if I'm trying to just define culture, I think this is a good way to sum it up. It's an organization's culture defines the proper way to behave within the organization. And I know that can be a little bit broad and not necessarily answer your question on what is culture, because I think it can be a very deep question. But I'm hoping by the end of it, you'll have at least a sense, kind of glean from the things that we talk about, what all is involved in having a good culture. And then one of the big focuses basically is the meat of the presentation is, how do you know if you have a good culture? And in the early days of Weave, measuring the culture just seemed super daunting to me. We could measure deployments, I could measure lead time, I could measure pull request frequency, but culture, I didn't know what to do. And so I had to do a lot of research and came upon some great insights, especially from one of the most data-driven companies ever created, being Google. And in 2012, Google created a project called Project Aristotle. And their goal was find out what makes the most effective teams at Google. What are the things about a team that make them the most effective, for the most effective teams? And they hired a very expensive, big research group to come in. Lasted for 3 years. They did studies of 180 different teams, and across sales and engineering, and they tested a whole bunch of different things and tried to find, hey, what is it that actually makes the most effective team? And you say, well, what does effective mean? And this is kind of how they define effective, but they basically try to take quantitative and qualitative data, and that means evaluating it from the executive team level, the team leader evaluation, a team member evaluation, and then sales performance against quarterly quota or quarterly OKR results in engineering, if you're familiar with OKR, which is objectives and key results, just a way of goal setting for engineering teams. So they put all this work in, and at the very end, I linked to a New York Times article that kind of sums it up. It's a long form article, but it's a great story on how they came upon this. And they spent a year doing research, a full year with this whole team. You can imagine, I mean, Google's big, so they can dump millions of dollars, and that's just the way they do it. But a whole year, and these are the factors that they did not contribute to team effectiveness, okay? Co-location of teammates, so whether they're in the same office or not, or remote. Do they have consensus-driven decision-making, or do they have kind of like a dictator tech lead that just kind of does whatever? Didn't correlate. Extroversion of the team members, was it a bunch of introverts? Didn't correlate. Individual performance of team members, which I thought was an interesting one, didn't have a significant driver, meaning one person doesn't just bring down the whole team if one person doesn't perform well. That didn't indicate whether a team did well or not. Workload size, which was interesting. They had some teams that had a lot of workload size and did very well, and other teams that had a lot of workload size and didn't do very well. It didn't contribute. Seniority, did they have some teams with like people with decades of experience, and then other teams with new people? Didn't contribute to the effectiveness of the team. And then tenure at Google didn't make a difference, which I thought was really interesting. You could have a 10-year veteran at Google on team, or you could have new hires. Didn't correlate to the team effectiveness, which I think is crazy. They did a whole year of research, and this is all they found. They actually didn't find any like trait or correlation on the effective teams, which I think was probably a little bit frustrating. But as they were pouring through the data, these traits kept popping up out of the research and the data and the surveys, and something that they called group norms. And so norms are these traditions, these behavioral standards and unwritten rules that govern how we function as a team. And so as they looked across this data for last year, the researchers decided that this is what they needed to focus on. This looked like something had some meat on it. And I'm going to posit that group norms are actually the equivalent of what we call team culture. That's what group norms are in this context. And so they started doing a lot more research around these norms or this culture. And they discovered a bunch of research that had already been done. And I think two of the most influential pieces of research that they came across were work done by Amy Edmondson on psychological safety, and then some other work on Dr. Ron Westrom's research on operational culture. And that is ultimately what helped guide what they did next. And I'll just give you a little bit a high level overview. I take it a little bit deeper in this than I have with other audiences, mainly because you're engineers, and I think you like going a little bit deeper. But the Westrom culture model it kind of created this spectrum of this terrible culture, slightly less terrible culture, and good culture. And the pathological culture, which is the worst, is this power oriented. You don't want to go deliver bad news to anybody, because when they say messengers get shot, if you were the one that delivered the bad news, you're the one getting fired. Like just terrible culture. And then you move your way up the stream, and you have this bureaucratic culture, which I think is probably the most common in business, in average businesses. You have some modest cooperation. It's very rule driven. You got to follow the rules. The responsibilities are very narrow and niched. And then I like that they say the messengers are neglected, meaning people will bring things to people's attention and they just get ignored, basically, because it's like, no. And then there's this generative culture, and this is what, the place that every aspiring software company wants to be at. It's performance oriented, high cooperation. The messengers are trained, risks are shared, bridging across teams is encouraged. Failure leads to inquiry, not justice and scapegoating and blaming others. And novelty is implemented. So like innovation, right, gets implemented. And this, at the very end, I link to the paper on this that he published on this culture model, and Google leveraged this heavily. Ultimately, he creates a way to measure, to find out where you are as a business with some simple questions that I'll get to in just a second. Before I get there though, I do want to highlight Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. And it had a big impact on Project Aristotle as well. And she put this name to this characteristic, which almost completely encompasses the Westrum's generative culture. And that is the psychological safety. She's the one that kind of coined that term, or at least made it more famous. And I linked to her TED Talk at the end of the slides, which I think she did in 2012. It's a great TED Talk. You definitely should go watch it. But one thing that I wanted to point out from her presentation is that, and I think this is very important, is that psychological safety and accountability are absolutely not at odds with each other. And she highlights this because sometimes if you're going to try and sell psychological safety to your sociopath executive team, when they hear psychological safety, sometimes they just hear warm and fuzzy engineering teams, no accountability. It's just, you're just trying to make your jobs cush, but that's absolutely not true at all. You can see she puts it on this quadrant, and the ideal place is you have performance accountability, and you have high psychological safety, and that's when you hit this learning zone. But if you don't have safety and it's only about performance and accountability, like it is at so many companies, that puts you in this anxiety zone. It's not generative. And then, maybe the worst case in a business is this comfort zone where you have psychological safety, no accountability, and that's where you get this warm and fuzzy place. And then, of course, you don't ever want to be in the apathy zone. No one likes that. So Google takes this research and starts measuring it according to the Westrum survey. And you know what happens? It turns out that psychological safety was by far the number one indicator of a team's success. The highest performance teams had the highest psychological safety, and it was way statistically significant. It wasn't even close. And they came up with a list of the top 7 traits, but this one is number 1 by far, which I thought was interesting. So how do you measure it? Well, the Westrum model gives these 6 questions that you can give out. And the way that Google did it, and I think the way that I think is wise to do it, based on some books that I have listed at the end, is you put it on a scale of strongly agree versus strongly disagree, and you kind of have 7 data points within there that you can choose for each one of these things. So like, on my team, information is actively sought. I strongly agree or I strongly disagree, and then anywhere in between, right? And so when we initially sent this survey out to our engineering team, and here were the results that we actually got. We set a target that we wanted to have 90% value. We placed a percentage on it, which basically means if you give strongly agree the 7s and strongly disagree 1s, then we wanted to average out at 6.3. Our average ended up coming to 5.72. So we actually fell pretty below further below where I wanted to be for sure, which was a little discouraging. And then what was even most discouraging was we had 2 really low results that down in the 3.4 range, which was like crazy. I was like, we're trying to focus on making everybody's job great, but we obviously were failing for some people. which really kind of woke us up a little bit. And I still remember we have a director of developer experience who runs these surveys, and he teared up a little bit. You know, he got up in front of the whole engineering department. He was like, because it's an anonymous survey, that's key to making this work, is making it anonymous. So we had no idea who it was, and he just said, look, if you are one of these too low scores, like please come to us. We want to make your work better. And since then, we've got an average above 6 most recently, and are no lows below, definitely not below 4. So we're definitely seeing some improvement there. But it's going to always be a very diligent focus. And this, I would say, is the psychological safety survey is probably the place you should start when you're trying to measure your culture, because it is so critical to high performing teams. This is where you should begin. Now, even though I would argue that psychological safety is essential for a high performing team, this is certainly not the only model out there. And there's other models that help you dive a little bit more into the details of how you want to build your operational culture. So if you want to be more deliberate, this is a great model. I think our chief architect Jason Newman found this article on InfoQ about how to tailor your DevOps culture using this competing values framework, which was really cool. And so this is where we learned about it, and we kind of used it to help transition our department to a culture that we wanted it to be. And the way it works is this model has competing values. On one axis, you have the flexibility and the over stability versus stability, and then you have an internal focus versus external focus, and that creates these 4 type of quadrants of operational culture values that pull against each other. And you can't have all of them. You can only have parts of each, and you kind of have to make a decision. And so the way that the survey works for this is it's a little bit more intensive than the psychological safety survey, right? It's not just 6 questions. There's actually about 10 questions, and they go like this. You say, okay, the organization, this is an example, the organization is a very personal place. It is like an extended family. People seem to share a lot of themselves. And then you have 2 columns, and you have to go and say, in the now column, you have to weight each one of these. So whether A, B, C, or D, and you have 100 points that you have to weight. So you could say, for instance, I'm going to give A 30 points. I think that's about right, the weight for where we are now. B 30 points, C 30 points, D 10 points, and it adds up to 100. But you have to make a decision on kind of where your culture falls based on these weighted numbers. And what I really like about this is you get the now. You can say, where are we now? But where do you want to be as an individual? Meaning, where do you want the organization to be in the future? Like, which way do you want to go? And that gives you some really, really good insights. It also lets you take your leadership team together, and you can design what you think is the best culture for your department. And then you get these cool charts, radar charts, if you're familiar. This is built from a Google form. And you can see we have the now and the preferred. The now is not any real data. This is fake data. But the preferred is actually the real values that as a leadership team we decided we wanted to have. So for instance, hierarchy, we only wanted to have as little process as possible. So you can see that value right here is lower than the others. But then we kind of wanted to have an equal distribution of clan, adhocratic, and market drivers driving the culture. And so then when you give out this survey to your engineers, you get it back. You can see where they think you are. So you can kind of see, do they think we're close to where we want to be? Excuse me. And then you can see, where do they want to be? It's super fascinating because we give it to our product owners, we give it to our engineers, and then you can pull it up by like tech leads. You can pull it up by the product owners. You can segment it into groups. the SRE teams, where do they think we need to be? And get a lot of data and insights about what type of engineers you have hired and what type of product people that you have hired. And then you can go and say, okay, we aren't quite, we're right now, if you're using this as an example, you say we're too far in the hierarchy for where we want to be. We want more autonomy in our teams. So we need to hire people that align with the value or that want the operational value of that's more ad hocratic. Okay. And so we often would give these surveys out to potential hires. And never once did we ever say, we're not going to hire this person because of the way they filled out their form. It wasn't used as a weapon necessarily, but it was kind of just to give us an idea. It can help with where you put people on teams, things like that. But has been super helpful, super valuable. So we give out the psychological survey every 6 months, and then we alternate with this survey every 6 months. So every quarter they have one or the other, and it's a great model for helping specifically build out a certain type of culture. I'm talking faster than when I practiced. Hopefully that's okay. Might finish it a
You're
little
fine.
quicker than I thought. Okay. The third and final method that we use to measure culture, and I think a lot of you are familiar with this, is the Spotify Squad Health Checks. This is a great measuring tool. We do it quarterly in a quarterly retrospective on every team. So the director of the team goes and meets with the team, and they go through this survey. It's 10 categories. I put 3 of them up here so you can get an idea of what they are. But like, for instance, easy to release is the first one. Releasing is simple, safe, painless, and mostly automated, or it's either risky, painful, lots of manual work, and takes forever. And then they announce the category, and then they have everyone live in a meetup. Now it's remote. They hold their hand out like this, and then they do a thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down. And the director tallies the results. You can see the picture on there on the left. You can see the tallies of some people with the frowny face, the middle face, and the happy face. And then they ask the question, is it getting better? Is it staying the same or getting worse? And they do the same thing. Hold up their hand, getting better, staying the same, or getting worse. And this gives you a lot of insight into how your teams are doing. We aggregate this all into one big view. And for instance, you can see like our deploy process sucks because we everyone gave it a yellow. And that's probably not good if every team gives it a yellow. And so kind of, oh, we need to work on this, or they're not having fun for some reason. Maybe they have too big of a workload, or are they delivering? Do they feel like they're delivering valuable stuff, or is it just crappy? Maybe they need some product help or focus. It's been a great thing. We do this every quarter. Some key things for running these health checks that I think are super important is you should not send these questions out as digital surveys. Part of the collection process on this is the live interaction. And you could say, well, there's going to be social pressure on my team to answer a certain way. And yeah, it's not perfect, right? There is going to be a little bit of social pressure because you'll see when you count to 3 and everybody's thumbs up except for you, you're kind of like, oh, why do I feel the way I do? But it causes great discussion. Excuse me, I'm going to apologize. This data should also not be weaponized, right? You shouldn't compare teams in a negative way if all of one team has greens and all of another team has all reds. It's like, oh, this green team is way better than this red team. It's like, no, something's wrong with the red team. I mean, like they're struggling to work together or they have too much work or something, but it's not that the team is better, right? It's just data. And then be transparent. If you want real answers and you want people to be real, you got to be transparent that you're not going to be using the data in a negative way. Like, this is all about helping improve the team and department as a whole. And so ultimately, those are the 3 methods that we use at Weave. If you could sum them all up into one, I would say it's you've got to be able as a leader to accept criticism without being defensive. That's what's going to create safety for your teams, because if you get defensive when someone comes to you with a problem or they tell you you're not doing a good job and you freak out at them, they're never going to come tell you again. I think that's, if I had to sum it up one way, that's what it would be. So, has focusing on operational culture been worth it at Weave? Let me take a drink here so I don't. Our CEO came up with people, product, and profits. And his mantra and his thesis is, if we take care of our people, our employees, then they will build the best product. And if they build the best product, then we will see profits. And so his focus, and he spends an inordinate amount of time on this, is on the people part as a CEO, which I love and I think is great. And so I'll tell you just some of these basic statistics over the last couple of years about how Weave has done. I'm going to start with profits and work back to people first. But as far as profits go, in 2018, we doubled our annual recurring revenue, which was huge for us. We were so excited. And then we set the goal in 2019 and did it again, doubled 2 years, year over year. And I think with COVID this year, we're probably not going to double. In fact, it's very safe to say we're not going to double. But I still think we're going to come out of this with a great year. We'll just have to see. But we also grew from 200 employees to 650 during that time. So you can imagine the type of, you have to onboard all these employees, you have to train them, and yet we were still able to double over the course of that time, which was pretty great. And I really, really attribute it most of the success to doing everything we could to take care of our employees. As far as the product goes, we saw less than 0.9% monthly customer churn in a small medium business market, which that is pretty good for small businesses. You think small businesses, they go out of business often. There's just a lot of things that go wrong with small business, and our investors love our churn numbers. They think we're better than almost all our portfolio companies for small business market. So that ended up being really great for us. And then 95% of our customers are using the product multiple times per week, which I think is a testament to, taking care of your people. They are passionate about building the best product, and it's working out for us in a lot of ways. Not that it's perfect. It's certainly not perfect. It probably sounds better than it is. We have our share of scaling issues and woes across the board, but it's done pretty well. Lastly, on the people side of things, which I am most proud of for sure, is we give out a survey to the entire company on Net Promoter Score, which is, would you recommend a friend to work at Weave? And we have above an 80 employee Net Promoter Score, which is outstanding. People are happy at Weave. They love working there. They feel motivated, and it comes through in that data. And then the last number I'll share with you is this number 3, which used to be number 2 until 2 weeks ago, but so be it. It's the number of people in product and engineering that have left Weave in the last 3 years. We have over 80 engineers now, and we've lost 3. And Kylie just left to Facebook. So she got to go move back to her hometown of Seattle and work on linguistics, which was her passion. So I don't blame her for even one bit. But if imagine the monetary savings on this. It's hard to ramp up engineers on a technology stack. We use Go, which 90% of the people we hire have never used it in production before. They've either just messed with it at their house or whatever. So there's a lot of ramp up time for an engineer to learn a new language, learn the stack, become proficient. And the fact that we're not losing employees means we don't have to retrain people. It's huge, huge monetary value. Use that as a selling point as you go back to your executive teams and are trying to push a better culture. Which leads me to the final challenge, which is come up with one way to improve. First of all, you have to go back and measure. Go measure. If you're just going to start with psychological safety, just give out the survey, make it anonymous, get the data so you have a baseline, but come up with one way to make it better in some way for your company, and it goes a long way, more than you would think. And lastly, I think these are the books that I think will summarize most recently with the most recent research, all the things that I've talked about in a good way. Accelerate, a lot of you are probably familiar with already, but that's more on the data-driven side. it does have a section on culture. It does talk about the Western model and how top performing teams follow that model and score well. It also talks about all the other important technology statistic drivers, metrics that you need to follow to have high performance teams. So great read. Team Topologies is a newer book this year. Great for how to deliberately build your teams in an organized way that are going to give them the highest performance, but also references cultural models, references Accelerate a lot. It references a whole bunch of research around culture, and it aggregates in a good way. Some of it's a repeat. I'm sure you read it and if you read it, you'll be like, okay, I know a lot of this stuff, but there's a lot of good nuggets in there that I think you can get out of it. And then lastly, the one that's not technology based, it's almost entirely about culture, is What You Do Is Who You Are by Ben Horowitz. He breaks down a lot of different cultural frameworks and models in here. And it ultimately is just a great book for if you want to build an amazing culture at your business. And I have references at the end here. I'll share the slides, but you can basically go read. Most of these are like summaries with even more references behind those that you can do to research a little bit deeper into these topics. And with that, I can start taking questions. I know that went fast. I talk quickly sometimes. Sorry.
No, that was fantastic. So I had a couple questions, and then please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, and I can pass them along. Or you can even say like, I have a question, and then I can let you know when it's your turn to ask. So don't have everyone unmute all at the same time and bombard with that awkward like Zoom delay. So I just lost my document. So it sounds like on that competing values assessment results. So just so I clarify, so your leadership team, you guys took as a leadership team first, got your results, and then you passed on to your staff, and then we're able to kind of compare and see, what that looked like.
Oh, you mean to design it? We actually didn't leverage. We just got together as a leadership team, looked at the framework, and decided what we wanted the culture to be without taking it first, and just said, how do we see success at Weave? We're not deeply technical. We're a small business. So what's going to be the most important? When we felt like we had to have a good balance of those three with just as minimal amount of process as possible, and that's where we settled on where we wanted to be. Then we gave the survey out to everybody, including leadership, on now and where we want it to be in the future, and then we can compare it and work and make sure there's not too much unbalance on any team.
How difficult was that conversation, like to come up what you as a leadership team, what you wanted that competing values assessment to look like?
Yeah, we did it 4 years ago, so there was like 3 leaders. So it wasn't too bad. If we had to have that same conversation today, I think it would be a little bit harder. And you know what? We probably should have it again and revisit it, because we've got some amazing new leaders that would bring a lot more insight into doing it. And I'm guessing it would take a little bit longer. But back then, I think we all were kind of in consensus that none of us liked a lot of red tape. And that's a negative way to describe that cultural value. But that's kind of the way we looked at it, to be honest, was it just we didn't like that. So it was easy for us to go through and figure that out we didn't want hierarchy, minimal amount of rules. But the things that we did like about it were, hey, we got to improve the efficiency. Like, we wanted to make sure we always were improving the efficiency. We needed enough rules that there was structure. So we didn't put it at 0. We just kind of put it at 10% of the 100.
Okay. Well, Kevin has a couple questions. I'll let him ask those.
Yeah. So Clint, thanks for doing this for us. So I work for an amazing company. I do have software as a service to some of my products, but the other products, we support a business that software is in the business. So I have to have a secondary culture. So my engineering teams have a culture. We practice it. but it is not the company culture. What can I do to improve that? Now, I invite other teams to our culture meetings. I evangelize it. I kind of help them see that. They really like it. I just can't get our CEO to buy into it. And it's because he wants autonomy. You know, what works for engineering may not work for sales.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, if the CEO is not bought in, I think your goal is to do everything you can to keep your department, keep the culture in your department good, and then keep evangelizing. That's pretty much before Weave. What you're describing has been almost every company I've ever been at. Right? They're not on the cutting edge of operational processes. They've run. It's very rule driven. If you're 5 minutes late, you get a pink slip. You know, like, and so I would come in, and my goal was, hey, look, that doesn't work in engineering, and start there, build up a great culture in engineering, high performance but high autonomy, and then as other people see the success, you just got to just do your best, influence based leadership. But if your CEO is not on board, all you can do is try to influence. That's all you can do.
Thanks. And kind of as a follow-up to this is one of those challenges. I believe culture is what we reward and what we punish. You know, if you narrow it down to the simplest thing, it's what we reward and what we punish. And, you know, the economy right now is difficult. And unfortunately, a lot of us as companies have had to make difficult decisions. How do you rebound after those difficult decisions, whether they be furloughs or layoffs or things like that? You know, we have to be naive to say that doesn't impact culture. And how do we get better?
Yeah, something that I find that's interesting is if you spend the time building up a great culture in the good times, when the bad times hit is actually when it makes the biggest difference. That's when it will actually you get your payout. You can have a mediocre culture with a growing successful company. I mean, that happens all the time, right? But then when the bad times hit, everything goes crazy at those type of companies. Now, we're not perfect. I'm a huge Simon Sinek fan. One of the things that he outlined is there was a company that said, hey, if you get a job here, you will always have a job here, and you will never lose your job. And when they hit hard times, everybody in the company took a pay cut instead of someone losing a job. Like, I love that. It Even at Weave though, we had a 10% layoff in COVID. We had it. As much as we fought and fought and fought to figure out how to do it, depending on your company, if it's venture backed, like we don't all the co-founders together aren't 50% owners anymore. So at some point we still have owners, and you just have to fight the fight as hard as you can. 30% of our sales came from events. Every single event got canceled this year. So we had this huge staff that literally had nothing to do. We tried repurposing them to digital events. We tried repurposing them, it couldn't work. And we ended up having to have a layoff, which was terrible. We hate it. It's not something that we wanted to do. And I think if we would have had full ownership of the company, we could have found a way that was maybe a little bit better. But in this case, there wasn't enough time. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but what I will tell you is this, that even with the layoff that we had, when you have that cultural stockpile built up, people rebound so quickly, way quicker than they would have otherwise. And so I think you still get a huge benefit on putting in that work up front.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I just, like I said, you know, as going through those reductions recently for my company, and again, ownership makes those decisions, and we respect ownership, and we do our best, and we advocate for our employees. My concern is there's always an element of doubt that comes in, and so, you know, we had an employee that because of the element of doubt moved on to a new opportunity. You know, and all it took was that one little opening, and
Yep.
Those are the unintended ripple effects.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any way around those specifically. Like, one thing that we did at Weave is we made sure we took out as much money as possible and gave them, you know, a full 3-month severance and 3 months of healthcare which actually kicked in next month. So they have 4 months of health care, trying to just do everything we could to take care of the employees that we let go, right? And that gives a signal to everybody else, like, look, we're trying. The executives took a pay cut, like, we're trying. It's not if you can signal it right, you're always going to have a risk of people leaving in those situations. We've just been lucky that we haven't yet.
Great. Yeah.
That doesn't answer your question.
No, it's just like I
Good
said.
luck. That's
I think these are the challenges as you get bigger teams and as you manage multiple products and you're trying to identify who you don't want to go and keep them safe. You talk about culture, and we just don't survive unless we have good cultures. We can't be high performing teams unless people want to learn and aren't afraid to fail. So yeah, 100% support what you're saying. I just wish there was an easy way to get past stupid COVID. That's kind of the way I feel right now.
Stupid COVID. I'm with you.
Yeah. Excellent. Anyone else with any other questions they'd love to ask Clint?
Do you do one-on-ones, Clint? Do you do skip levels?
Yeah, we do. When I hired a VP of engineering, I only have like a handful of direct reports. All our like tribe level architects report to me. The VP of engineering has most of the engineering report up to him. He's definitely doing skip levels all the time. I don't do them as much just because those people don't roll up under me, but I have one-on-ones occasionally with people. Yeah.
Let's see. Is there a question that I want to ask to stump Clint?
To stump me?
Yeah.
That won't be hard.
Well, at least you got the humble trait pretty good. That's
yeah. Again, that's not hard either.
No.
One thing that when you're open to taking criticism from your engineering team, it comes a lot in a lot of cases, right? There's definitely there's a million ways to improve, and when they feel comfortable, they complain, as they should, and it can be humbling.
No, very good.
When they complain, do they take ownership when you give them a authority to do so? Like, great, this is a problem. What are you going to do about it?
It depends on what the complaint is, but lots of times the complaint is, hey, our leadership sucks. You need to do better. It's like, not in those words, right? They're respectful. But when it comes in, it's like, hey, you handled this situation in a way that wasn't good. And I'm like, you kind of have to have a little bit of thick skin. And you're like, yeah, you're right. I didn't handle that situation good. And one thing that's just hard, at least for me, is this is a first time co-founder of any type of success, right? I've had 3 failed startups that never had employees. And now I have this, 80 engineer, pushing 100 now, engineers organization over the last 7 years. And it's like, the learning curve is steep to be a leader. It's steep. And I think that's one of the reasons why Justin created this group, is because it's hard and it's lonely. It's just difficult. Like every year I was by myself, then I'm a team lead, then I'm a director, then I'm a VP of engineering. Now I'm a CTO of a $1 billion company, and I don't know what I'm doing. Thankfully, my board has no idea. I just use buzzwords all the time, and they're like, okay, sweet. But it's hard, right? It's hard to stay ahead of it. We do have some great seasoned executives that we've hired that help coach us, which has been great. Jeff knows Jefferson Lyman came from Vivint. He was the chief product officer there, and he's incredible. Been a great executive coach for me, and I feel pretty lucky that I get to work with him. But yeah, it's steep learning curve, and that's why you guys are all here. Hopefully, is that we can help support each other and learn and be better.
So, you say you need to be open to criticism, like that. It's easier said than done. Like, what are some tactics that you have found helpful to make sure that when those issues are raised up, that you are able to not get defensive and be open and listen? And
one of the things that I think has been awesome about Weave, although it's canceled during COVID, so that sucks, but we had this fairly robust coaching program, and it started at the executive team, right? I had a career coach, Whitney Johnson, and she came in and we did this full 360 review, and of course it came out, which was very accurate, that I got super defensive when these things came up, or I was very stick in the mud on change when people suggested change. And so Whitney had me log every day when something happened that like pushed a button of mine, like an engineer came with an architectural decision that I thought was stupid, or someone gave me criticism. I had to log it and say how I handled it, whether it was good or bad. And just the fact that I had to log it every day made me improve because it was focused. And so the technique that I would use was if someone did something or was critical, I would take a breath and count to 3 and be like, okay, don't get to fight or flight mode here. Don't get to that part of the brain that gets super aggressive. Just take it, be calm, and just logging it helped. And so now I have my architects. He's trying to work on the same thing. He did a 360 review, and we're doing it together. And so every one-on-one we get together and we share our logs and how we improved. And I think that's a huge way to be better. It's just to pick one thing that you want to work on and work on it every day. Something little, not big.
Very good. Stuart asked a question in chat. Says, as you ramp up hiring, how do you decide when and where to split teams? If, for example, product features, skill sets, personalities, what do you wish you'd done differently? Great question.
Oh, this is like the constant battle. Like we have debates on this all the time. We just had a huge debate on splitting. One of the services we offer is two-way texting for business. It's been one of our most successful features. We've offered it for over 8 years now. And we just barely split out a team to do SMS platform team, where all they worry about is deliverability, compliance, and the APIs for the other teams to consume those. I wish I could say we just had like a philosophy and a formula for when to split teams. The only thing I could tell you is we definitely try to if you read team topologies, we're definitely trying to align that way, where we have product or what they call stream flow teams. Then you have like supporting teams, platform teams. Then you have like really deep skill-based teams for things that you need. And then you have like SRE teams. So if you read all the different team types in team topologies, that's how we're trying to structure it. We don't have a good formula for when to split. So we're just doing our best. We're having a hard time even determining domains, to be honest. Like we're trying to organize code bases into groups and things like that. And it's like, how do we determine when we have a domain, when a domain should split? I'm almost getting to the point where I'm fed up and I'm just going to say it's a flat structure and we're not grouping our code in any way. But anyway.
Well, excellent.
Sorry, that doesn't answer your question.
Go gadget monolith.
Yeah, go gadget monolith. That's a tough one. Yeah, I don't think there is any easy answer. I think the biggest thing for me is that sometimes I try to like take a step back and say, what are my overarching goals, or like what am I trying to accomplish? But that only kind of like gives you like a foggy picture. And then when you get down to the actual brass tacks of like, well, who's going to be on what team and how is it split, whatever, it's hard. And I think at least I found the hardest thing too is that sometimes when you make those splits is like, it's unlike a code deploy, which you can easily like test and roll back. That's the kind of stuff that you can't, quickly iterate, because people will get really frustrated if you're like restructuring teams like every
definitely
3-4 weeks.
Yeah, if you want your teams to be high producing, you cannot be changing them a lot because it takes a while to get cohesion, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I wish I would have done differently, since that was part of the question, is we'd have these teams of like 6 engineers, and we're like, okay, the product owner is not able to focus enough on this section of the product. We're going to take 2 engineers and make a team. Well, I can tell you 2 engineers is not a team. It doesn't behave like a team. It doesn't run like a team. If I could go back in time, I would never do that again. Like I fight now if anyone tries to create a team less than 5. Like don't do that, because it creates some unhealthy practices on those smaller teams.
I'm going to jump. I'm curious. Like, what do you mean by those? And then we have a couple questions. Like, what do you mean? Like, how would you define those unhealthy practices with the smaller teams?
Maybe unhealthy practice isn't the right. They don't have to create good team communication habits.
Okay.
Because it's just 2 of them. It's like a startup where they're in the same garage, which I know you could think is compelling, but then as their scope grows and you add more people to it, there's a lot of friction. And they don't have good habits around how they're doing testing or they're rubber stamping all their code reviews back and forth with each other, not getting them reviewed. I'm sure there's mitigations for that to have a small team. I'm pushing to not have to deal with those mitigations and just keeping larger teams and figuring out how to mitigate the focus a little bit better, so that segment, assign projects in a way that gives you more focus instead of trying to have to split a physical team.
Oh, very good. Okay, Joe asked. He said, and you mentioned some of these in your slides, but it says, not sure if this has been asked. I joined late. What are you reading and learning to level up on leadership?
Yeah, there's 3 books that I did mention, Joe, that I think are like essential reading. Team Topologies is the most recent one that I'm reading. Again, it's not going to have it's not earth shattering, but there's a lot of good nuggets in there, and I think will help you be more deliberate about how you structure your teams. Definitely mentioned what you do is who you are as far as building cultures and building good cultures for your teams. Also helps you analyze and encompass what a good culture means. And then I had the Accelerate book, and then the last thing I'll mention is if you do RSS feeds, which I know feels like it's like a early 90s technology, but I still do it. Still do it, and it's been great. I have what is it? I'm having a brain cramp. I have an RSS reader. I forget what it's called. And I subscribe to things like the InfoQ's website. They have a section on just culture and operations, and I subscribe to that. And I'll go into it's gonna kill me. I've got to say it. Feedly. You can subscribe to all these things and put them in categories in Feedly. So I have a culture channel in Feedly, and I take these RSS feeds around culture and put them in Harvard Business Review culture, InfoQ culture, and that's how I kind of aggregate and get the best content that I can find. And then the best ones that I have, we have what we call an Engineering Edge channel in Slack at Weave, and I post them in there, the ones that I think are the best to share with the entire department. And then every other week we have an Engineering Edge meetup where we have a presenter come. Sometimes it's internal, sometimes it'll be external, and it's just to help polish our skills a little bit more. Some of it's cultural, some of it's technical. So that's kind of how I keep up to date with what to read.
Cool,
awesome.
Thanks.
Okay, H has a question.
Hey, Clint. So at the beginning of the presentation, when you were talking about the study that Google had done, you talked about all of these things that didn't matter, and they didn't find a correlative relationship with performance, being a high performing team. So taking that into consideration, when you're looking at questions like how do we split out the domains, or how do we create teams, how do you figure out which of those questions the answer actually matters?
Yeah, I think the key there though is if psychological safety ends up, one caveat that I didn't put in there is, look, we're not Google, you're not Google, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? But I do see the benefits of psychological safety. So let's just assume that for most companies, most software companies, psychological safety is the #1 driver of performance. The thing that matters most then is to never create a team where there's not going to be psychological safety, right? That's going to be the thing that matters most. And I think even though, like I say, hey, I have all these things that I wouldn't do in the past from team divisions and trying to figure out domains and things like that, in the end, even when we've made this poor decisions on how to structure those teams, the outcomes if we wouldn't have had safety on those teams, they would have had way worse outcomes than what we had. They were still productive. They still killed it, but there might have been a little bit incremental change we could have made that would have been better. And so the key is just to not hire a-holes, right? Because an a-hole makes it on the team, everyone else clam up. And if they're not afraid, if they're too scared to talk because there's a jerk that knows everything about engineering, that team's not going to perform. They just won't. In fact, we come up with ways to make sure everyone's voice is heard, even the introverts. Like we teach our tech leads and train them. When you're having your planning meeting, ask this person what they think. Ask that person what they think. Make sure everyone has a voice, because that's what brings that safety and gives you high performance. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think part of it is also, when you bring up those questions that you were talking about, they sort of feel like they're high stress things to you. Like we're wrestling with this decision of, how to separate out the domains, or how to separate the, organize the teams, or things like that. And, I guess kind of the heart of the question is, do those need to be high stress conversations if in the end the answer may not be as important as do we have a well-functioning team that can perform, wherever we put them and however we task them.
Amen to that. I'm taking that back, and I'm gonna just make the decision and be like, it doesn't matter. So thank you. H
It
with
doesn't
the
matter
wisdom.
how you do it, so you're just going to do it my way.
Oh, I'll make sure I
Slack.
Slack.
Like, hey, it doesn't matter.
I'll Slack some people on your team the recording of this video when I post it. Just say, hey, if this totally has a meltdown, you can point back to this point in time and be like,
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
no. Okay. So Jeff just wanted to give another shout out for what you do is who you are. Just reemphasize that on his behalf. And then Kevin has. I'll just let you ask your question.
All right, so
and then we'll start to wrap up.
I want to follow up on the last one. Two things. So psychological safety. Our Utah culture is not good about speaking up. We are very good about doing what we're told and respecting our leaders. What do you do to promote that? And then going backwards, I want to know what you do to not hire a-holes.
Oh man, we're not 100% successful on that. But for the kind of overcoming the culture, with the younger generations, so when we hire millennials, it hasn't been as big a problem. They seem to be less scared in general. Obviously, I'm not going to categorize everybody, but in general, they just are not afraid to speak up, which I think is great. But we have some older engineers that are definitely like, yes sir, I'm going to do it. And it's like, no. So what we do is we try to highlight when someone complains. We have something called internal RFCs, and when someone brings a problem, we'll ask them to create an internal request for comment, which is basically a document that says, hey, we have a problem here, and here's a proposed solution I want to come on it. And we highly reward them for bringing up the problem. Like we show it in Engineering Edge Hour and be like, hey, look at this RFC this. I always reference Colton because he's our biggest complainer. He's one of our best engineers, so he's great. Look at the Colton, the complainer, came up with this again. Way to go, Colton. And we'll tease him about complaining, but people see that we reward it, and I think that helps. But I've had to have some heart-to-hearts with some of our engineers and be like, just because I said it doesn't mean you should just go do it. Like, tell me if you know the domain of your squad, your team better than I do at this point. You tell me if that's the wrong decision, and there's going to be a lot of trust on you. Like, I'll let you do what you think is best. So don't just take it for face value, and certainly don't wait for instructions from your managers, right? Like you're as a team, you need to be autonomous and work on your own. But yeah, we still have to have those heart-to-hearts. Not hiring, how do you account for humility? And it's one of our core engineering values is humility. How do you account for that in the interview process? We ask questions about how would you act in this type of situation, which kind of give us an idea. In some cases, you can kind of tell when someone thinks their technology choices are better than everyone else. And if they come and say everyone that they were working with at their last company is a bunch of idiots, it's kind of a red flag. But again, it's not perfect for us. And if we make a mistake, we aggressively try to coach people on like, hey, the way you're communicating isn't great, and we want to help you. And if it doesn't, then we have to let them go. But we'll give them a good fighting chance to improve, and people have for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that and just say, I think, one of the things we've been trying to do is ask some of those good open-ended questions in our interview process to kind of tease out, what some like the attributes and traits that we're looking for in our engineers, and that humility is one of them. And then the other part is that, when they join, because there's only so much you can do in the interview process, is taking advantage of that. I mean, we even have it in our language of when we hire someone, kind of those first 90 days are kind of like a probationary period where we're like, we really want to see how they work. And then setting the expectation up front of saying, hey, there might be some minor things that we discuss during those 90 days that might feel kind of out of proportion in the sense of like, man, I was only like, it was just one meeting where I kind of made these comments. And I'm saying, look, we like to nip it in the butt, and these things can grow long term over a year that become these big deals, and say we just want to avoid that. And so trying to set expectations like, hey, they're going to get probably a lot more coaching than you're expecting those first 90 days. And that way we can early identify, because the last thing you want is to have like someone brought on and they have that kind of that low grade toxicity, that those individual things don't matter. But after being on a team with that person for a year, people are struggling, and it's like, oh, then you have this really serious issue. When you go to identify it, they're like, well, these are little things. I'm like, yeah, but there's 1,000 of them,
Yep.
So
I love that mentality. That's great.
Addressing it up front. And there's a lot of these things we've learned just from making mistakes, and we're saying, hey, we need to be a lot more upfront with our expectations, and set an expectation when you do have that conversation on like day 30 of like, hey, you're kind of aggressive in meetings. Or you say, hey, you don't mention anything in meetings, but you'll kind of go and complain to other people behind, either being very aggressive or very passive, saying, hey, like, that's not going to be a good strategy for long term here. Let's work on this. So
that's awesome.
All right. Okay. Any final lingering questions before we let Clint go to for the rest of his evening, or you can stick around and people can hang out and chat on the Zoom. I almost called it a hangout. So any questions before we wrap up?
Hey, Clint, I hate to steal all your time, but one other thing. How do you promote that change is expensive? So planned work is always the most efficient work. It's the most quality work. We're agile teams, we can change, but there's always a cost with change. So, let's say we're working on project A and mid-flight leadership decides to change to project B. We leave that work undone. There's a cost. How do we help educate our leadership about that?
Yeah. Oh man, that could be a whole presentation. It's a struggle. That's not a struggle that's unique to your company, I can assure you, and even unique to engineering leaders, even at the small scale. Like we've done it to several teams, and I wish we had blown up roadmaps there. But as far as educating the people above you, like I went to my CEO and just said, because he was like jerking us around in the early days, like every couple of weeks, like we got to do this. And I just showed him all the research on context switching and said, this is what's happening. It's not just that you're pushing back the roadmap for these other things, like you're literally causing everything to go slower. And once he saw that, he's like, oh, okay. He's like, so can I just come to you with ideas and you put them down for later? I'm like, absolutely. You can talk to me. And we would meet once a week and he'd tell me all his bazillion ideas and they would change every other week and it was fine. But if you don't have access to the CEO and your CEO's like that, again, it's all about influence-based leadership and you just have to do your best.
All right. Any parting words for us, Clint?
No, I hope this has been valuable for everybody. I think this group is incredible. I love coming to these meetups, and yeah, let's keep getting better. Looking forward to next month.
That's right. Speaking of next month, we're still looking for a speaker. So if you have any interest in speaking next month, I think Slack's back up. You can shoot me a Slack on the Forge Utah Slack. You can send me an email at justin@justincarmody.com, or you can send me a message on Meetup. Just reach out and say, hey, I'm interested in talking about, whatever you feel passionate about talking about. And
like Kevin has a whole bunch of questions, like come into the engineering leadership channel on Slack and just ask those questions when they come up. You're going to have a lot of good experience in that channel to answer those type of questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you, Clint. Thank you for joining. I am now going to hit the stop record button.